Jean Wolfe, a 17-year-old recent high school graduate from Nitro, West Virginia, was about to undertake a trip of a lifetime, and in the process, helped to reform what the average American thought a woman could achieve. For her, what started out as a fun summer adventure ended up as something that would change the lives of millions of Americans. Wolfe wrote to her mother exciting news. "We are really having a good time. We are getting paid for doing housework and cleaning up the camp. We also met some cute and nice boys. They have all heard about the Women's Land Army." In June of 1944, Jean, along with an estimated 3 million American women, were on a mission. The crops needed to be sown that spring, and no less than a victory in World War II was at stake. While millions of American men were fighting for a victory on the battlefield, many patriotic American women worked for a victory on the home front. They joined the ranks of the employed in wartime factories, joined branches of the military to perform special duties, and did their part in homes and families. And while guns and willpower won battles, that same willpower fueled a women's movement in the farms and fields of a rural America that would make true Napoleon's idiom that an army marches on its stomach. The unique contributions of the Women's Land Army on the home front during World War II not only enabled agricultural producers to harvest the crops necessary to win the war, but brought independence, respect, and a greater acceptance of women as contributors to American society, encouraging them to seek equality in the decades to follow. In the early months of World War II, as men headed off to war and women were left to take care of families and homes, they were faced with a frightening realization. Food supplies were already tight, and families were forced to deal with a complex rationing system. Food prices were beginning to reflect those shortages. What would the effect of even greater food shortages mean to food prices? Across the country, farmers searched for laborers to pick the cherries, peaches, and apples, to plant seeds for crops, and to milk cows. As the ranks of the Army, Navy, and Marines swelled with young men, farmers found fewer and fewer to take on these jobs. Even before the government took official action, some women traveled to farms to take on work so they could afford to feed their families. This initiative would lead to the start of the Women's Land Army. The Women's Land Army was used first by the British, then America during the First World War. The government at that time wanted women to get more involved in the production of food and do their part to support the war effort. These efforts in the Great War laid the foundations for another, even greater effort by women in the Second World War to rescue the nation's food supply and revolutionize the kind of work that the public perceived women could accomplish. The demand for young men in the military led to a dangerous shortage of workers on America's farms. Producers explored their options. Farm laborers during World War II included urban youth, active duty soldiers, white-collar professionals, Japanese Americans displaced by internment, African Americans, Native Americans, migrant workers from Mexico and Jamaica, and even German prisoners of war. But the nation's urgent demand for food to feed itself, the nation, its allies, and its armed forces required a larger and more stable labor supply. Amid numerous grassroots efforts by women across the country to take on farm work and urge an official program, the United States Congress responded and approved Public Law 45, the Farm Labor Supply Appropriation Act, in order to assist farmers in producing vital food by making labor available at the time and place it is most needed. Under the direction of the Emergency Farm Labor Service, with strong support from Eleanor Roosevelt, the Women's Land Army was established in April of 1943 with Florence Hall as chief. Ultimately, 3 million women eventually participated in the Women's Land Army. The situation was urgent. Millions had left the fields and farms for higher-paying wartime factory jobs or for service in the armed forces. At the same time, farmers were asked to increase production to help win the war. Women with little or no agricultural experience answered the call and saved numerous crops from rotting in the fields. Women were not expected to have farming experience, but the WLA specified that the applicants be any women 18 years of age or older that is physically fit. A good amount of patience, curiosity, and patriotism would round the ideal farmerette. The Women's Land Army recruited more than 1 million female workers, drawn from the ranks of high school and college students, beauticians, accountants, bank tellers, teachers, and musicians. Individual states' agricultural extension services assumed responsibility for the emergency farm labor programs, primarily by coordinating and overseeing labor recruitment, training, and placement. The women worked long, hard hours driving tractors, tending crops, and even shearing sheep. Many members of the Women's Land Army faced doubters who insisted that women were not strong enough to do men's farm work. Most laborers received an unskilled labor's wage of 25 to 40 cents per hour, out of which they were expected to pay for their denim overall uniforms and perhaps meals and lodging in temporary camps, summer cabins, or private homes. The work days were hard, and after one particularly long day, Jean Wolfe wrote to her mother, "Boy, am I tired. We thinned peaches today. The man said we were good and did okay. It's not so hard to do, but it's sort of monotonous. Boy, I bet I'll dream of peaches tonight." Most women worked on a day haul basis. They lived at home and were transported to farms by personal cars, growers' trucks, or school buses. Sometimes known as the Housewives Express, these women, usually urban housewives, treated the Women's Land Army as a kind of job. After they sent their children off to school, they would make their way to the farms where they would hoe, weed, thin, and harvest crops of all kinds. Many supervised youth platoons, especially teachers out of school for the summer. By mid-afternoon, they would be home as their children returned from school. The girls of the Women's Land Army performed a myriad of tasks, from the thinning of peaches, apples, and vegetables to later harvesting those fruits and vegetables. They performed almost every kind of work necessary on farms across the country. Women in the Women's Land Army were paid less than those working in factories and the military, and the work was less glamorous. However, each time a woman was placed on a farm job, it freed up a man to fight. The women in the Women's Land Army felt a direct connection between themselves and the boys overseas. They saw their work as a patriotic duty and could easily imagine how they were helping their brothers, sweethearts, or husbands serving overseas in uniform. Most workers did not join the Women's Land Army to make money, but to contribute to the war effort. The Women's Bureau reported that the percentage of women employed in agriculture rose from 8% in 1940 to 22% in 1945. The United States Department of Agriculture estimated that it had placed approximately 1.5 million non-farm women in farm jobs between 1943 and 1945. By 1945, the Women's Land Army had more than proved itself by successfully contributing to increasing the nation's wartime food production by 32%. This was all accomplished with fewer men to till and harvest the soil. A virtual army of women were out, doing the work that many said they could not do. In some states, such as Oregon, women continued to volunteer their services in the post-war period all the way through 1947. As the war neared its end, women as agricultural workers earned appreciation by many. They were even the topic of many magazine articles, and members of the Women's Land Army appeared on the covers of Life, Time, and other popular magazines, giving the women a tremendous validation. The government did its part to convince the public that the Women's Land Army was vital to the nation's war effort. They educated the American people with statements such as, "Free people everywhere can be as grateful to the farm families that are making victory possible," using the motto, "Food fights for freedom." Pamphlets and posters were distributed emphasizing that raising food is a real war job, and bread is ammunition as vital as bullets. Men initially were very reluctant to use women as agricultural workers. Americans realized that the women who answered the call of the Women's Land Army and their country in the time of need were conscientious, acting out of patriotism, and really could perform much of the work that farmers demanded, even the heavy labor. Many began to speak out on the important contributions that women had made. This recognition started a momentum that women rode in the post-war years as they continued to fight for recognition as valid contributors to society. The nation's triumph in World War II was a result of the combined efforts of millions of men and women in all sectors of society who worked for victory. By the end of the Second World War, there was little question that men may have fought to defend the land, but it was the women who toiled in it. These women, like soldiers in overalls, had successfully come to the rescue, saving not only our nation's food supply, but perhaps the nation itself.